Here are the top 10 historical references to Jesus outside the Bible. So the first one is from a guy named Tacitus. He was a Roman historian and a senator. And in 116 AD, in a book called Annals, he writes that this Christus character, or Christ, he suffered an extreme penalty under the reign of Tiberius and at the hands of Pontius Pilate. He refers to the Christian belief as a most mischievous superstition, acknowledging that it was its own religion, and mentions that not only that it broke out in Judea, but made its way to Rome itself. That would be Paul. After that, we have a guy named Josephus. He was a Jewish historian, and certainly not a believer of Jesus. But in his book, The Antiquities of the Jews, there's a couple references to Jesus as well. In 93 AD, he wrote about James, calling him the brother of Jesus, who was called the Christ. And then after that, he writes that Jesus was known as a wise man, a doer of wonderful works, admitting that miracles were reported, and that Pilate condemned him to the cross. And then he calls the Christians a tribe that are named after him and were not extinct at the time of his writing. After that, we have Pliny, or Pliny the Younger. I'm not sure how you pronounce it, actually. He was a Roman governor and a letter writer. In 112 AD, he writes, mentioning Christians that they sang hymns to Christ as to God. Fascinating, huh? And they bound themselves by an oath not to commit crimes, being subject to the authorities above them, like Peter says. How about that? Then we have Suetonius. He's a Roman historian and a biographer. In 121 AD, in his book Life of Claudius, he writes, since the Jews constantly made disturbances at the instigation of Christus, or Christ, he expelled them from Rome. This fits with what we already understand. The Christians were expelled from Rome. Then we have Mara bar Siparian. Now, Mara is a Stoic philosopher. And in 70 AD, possibly late 1st century, he writes in a letter to his son, he says, what advantage did Jews gain from executing their wise king? He lived on in the teaching he had given, at least admitting, hey, this Jesus guy, he taught and he existed and they executed him. Now, one of the fascinating ones is the Babylonian Talmud. This was written by a rabbinic legal scholar, and it was compiled later, but likely written in the 1st or 2nd century. And it says, on the eve of Passover, Yeshua or Jesus, was hanged. That's a reference to being hanged on a cross, because he practiced sorcery and enticed Israel to apostasy. They understood that Jesus did what seemed like sorcery, miracles, and that he was getting them away from the old covenant. Then we have a guy named Julius Africanus, and he is quoting the writings of a guy named Thallus who wrote in 50 AD. And in that fragment that he quotes, he says, Thallus, in the 3rd book of his histories, explains away the darkness, which is at Christ's crucifixion, an eclipse of the sun. It mentions the darkness that the Bible does. After that, you have a Greek artist named Lucian of Samosata. And in about 130 AD, he writes about the Christians, not favorably, and says that they still worship their crucified sage who introduced their novel rites, R-I-T-E-S, rites, and was crucified on that account, that he was crucified for his teachings that they follow. And lastly, number 10, we have Celsus. Now, Celsus is a Greek philosopher, and he's referencing earlier sources. So in the 2nd century, he's writing about 1st century sources and saying that Jesus made up his virgin birth and was a sorcerer who performed miracles by magic. Now, clearly he didn't believe, but he acknowledges that Christians believed that Jesus was a virgin-born person who did miracles. So even the enemies of Jesus attest to who he is.